Imagine a war where the enemy wasn't a foreign invader, but the person living next door, where brothers hunted brothers across blood-soaked fields and the American flag was ripped in half. This is the haunting story of a nation that committed suicide to find its soul, a conflict that claimed 1 million lives and redefined freedom forever. Today, we step into the darkest shadows of the American Civil War. The year was 1860, but the seeds of this catastrophe were planted in 1776. When the Founding Fathers penned the words, "All men are created equal," they did so in a room where many of them owned human beings. This was the original sin of America, a ticking time bomb placed at the very heart of the Constitution. For 80 years, that bomb hummed quietly as the nation grew, but by the mid-19th century, the fuse had finally burnt down to the powder. The United States was a miracle of expansion. We had just won a war with Mexico, adding vast territories from Texas to California. But with every new acre of land came a deadly question. Will this soil be worked by free men or by slaves? In the North, a transformation was occurring that the world had never seen. This was the market revolution. In cities like Lowell and Rochester, the sound of the waterfall was replaced by the roar of the steam turbine. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany were pouring into northern docks. To the northerner, the future was iron. It was the railroad, the telegraph, and the steamship. They believed in free soil, free speech, and free men. But move your gaze south, past the Mason-Dixon line, and the atmosphere changes. The air is heavy and silent, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the hoe in the dirt. This was the Cotton Kingdom. By 1850, the South produced 75% of the world's cotton. The South was an agrarian aristocracy, a feudal hierarchy where planters, the 1% who owned more than 20 slaves, controlled all the wealth and politics. To them, the North was a chaotic hive of wage slaves and radical fanatics. The struggle wasn't just moral, it was a cold-blooded fight for the American treasury. The North wanted high tariffs to force the South to buy Northern-made tools. To the Southerner, this was Yankee theft. This led to the nullification crisis, where Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun argued that a state had the right to ignore federal laws. This was the birth of states' rights. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act required Northern citizens to help catch runaway slaves. Slavery was no longer a distant problem, it was now in their streets. Then came Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, humanized the enslaved. It made the North weep and the South furious. In the North, it became the second most read book after the Bible, but the real fire started in Kansas. In 1854, the vote on slavery led to a mini civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Abolitionists like John Brown responded with the sword, believing he was God's instrument. Blood had been shed on American soil, and there was no going back. By 1860, the political parties had shattered. Amidst this chaos rose Abraham Lincoln. He didn't promise to end slavery in the South, only to stop it from spreading. When Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state, the South felt they no longer had a voice. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina dissolved its union with the United States. The winter of 1861 was the Great Wait. Federal forts across the South were being seized, but one fort held out, Fort Sumter. Lincoln faced an impossible choice. He sent bread, not bullets, placing the burden of the first shot on the South. At 4:30 and on April 12, 1861, a signal flare rose into the night sky and the bombardment began. The summer of 1861 was a season of profound innocence. Young men from farms and social clubs rushed to enlist, viewing war as a grand adventure. They had no idea they were marching into the first total war in human history. Training was rudimentary. They spent days learning to march in tight formations, tactics left over from Napoleon. On July 21st, 1861, the two raw armies met at Bull Run. Washington socialites drove out with picnic baskets to watch, but the retreat turned into a great skedaddle. The picnic was over. By the winter, George B. McClellan turned the Union Army into a professional machine, but he was terrified to use it. Technology was advancing faster than tactics. The rifle musket allowed a soldier to hit a target from 500 yards away. Defensive forces now had a massive advantage, yet the manuals remained the same. This was the meat grinder. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant emerged. He was a man of results, capturing Fort Donelson and demanding unconditional surrender. But Grant was nearly halted at Shiloh, where 23,000 casualties in 2 days shocked both nations. In the east, Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army. He was a brilliant, aggressive tactician. In the 7 days battles, Lee attacked McClellan repeatedly, forcing a Union retreat. On the water, the Anaconda Plan aimed to strangle the South. In March 1862, the ironclads CSS Virginia and US Monitor fought to a stalemate, making every wooden navy on Earth obsolete. For the common soldier, war was 90% waiting and marching. Disease was the greatest killer. Dysentery and typhoid killed thousands in filthy camps. Soldiers fueled themselves on hardtack, a cracker so hard it could break teeth, and dreamed of home. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln struck at the heart of the rebellion, slavery. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, turning the war into a crusade for human dignity. European powers could no longer support the South without supporting slavery. The end of 1862 saw the Union's lowest point at Fredericksburg, where Union soldiers were mowed down in rows. But the story of the 54th Massachusetts proved that black soldiers were just as brave as any others, fighting for the right to be called men. 1863 began with a cold uncertainty. The North was divided, and the South was starving. At Chancellorsville, Lee performed his masterpiece, splitting his army to defeat a larger force. But he lost Stonewall Jackson to friendly fire, a blow the South could never recover from. Lee decided to gamble everything on an invasion of the North. The two monsters collided at Gettysburg. For 3 days, the ground turned red. From the struggle at Little Round Top to the suicidal bravery of Pickett's charge, Gettysburg was the high watermark of the Confederacy. On the same day Lee retreated, Vicksburg fell to Grant. The Mississippi was a Union river, the Confederacy was cut in half. By 1864, the war entered its most brutal phase. Grant was called east to face Lee. He knew the math, the North had more men. In the wilderness, the woods caught fire, burning wounded men alive. At Spotsylvania, they fought hand to hand for 24 hours in a trench filled with blood. Grant pinned Lee at Petersburg, while Sherman was unleashed in the west. Sherman's march to the sea was a whirlwind of fire, breaking the South's will by destroying everything in his path. War was no longer about soldiers, it was about the total destruction of the enemy's resources. The sheer scale of the logistical machinery required to maintain this conflict was immense. A soldier carried 60 pounds of gear, marching on shoes that had no left or right. They lived in cities of huts, fighting lice and scurvy more often than bullets. 19th century medicine was a nightmare. Surgeons were sawbones who believed pus was a sign of healing. If you were shot in the gut, you bit a bullet and waited for the end. Final year was the Siege of Souls. Grant's campaign was a masterpiece of grim persistence. At the Bloody Angle, an oak tree 22 inches thick was cut down by musket fire alone. The North's factories were churning out boots and rifles, while Southern women were rioting for bread. When the end finally came at Appomattox, Lee surrendered with dignity, and Grant responded with grace. "The rebels are our countrymen again," he said. But the joy was short-lived. Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth plunged the nation into a dark grief. The Reconstruction that followed was a battle of wills. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments gave birth to modern equality, but the rise of the CKK and Jim Crow delayed the promise of freedom for a century. The American Civil War stands as a monument to the cost of human freedom. It was a 10,000-word epic written in the red ink of American blood. It reminds us that a nation is not just land, but a shared idea. That idea that all men are created equal was baptized in the fire and survived. The ghosts of Gettysburg still speak, telling us that the work of unity is never truly finished. To deep dive into the tactical brilliance of the generals, we must look at their feuds. McClellan hated Lincoln, Grant trusted Sherman, Lee missed Jackson,